Hello, this is Dr. Esmacher. Welcome to today's session on the 1990s. We're going to wrap up the political stuff in the 90s, including Clinton's impeachment next class. Okay, so today we're going to be focusing mostly on changes to the economy brought on by computers and the internet, and we're also going to talk about the phenomenon of immigration and talk a little bit more about the experiences of different rising minority groups in the United States during the 1990s. So let's dig in. So the economy in the 1990s was among the most profitable it had been in decades. So the United States is definitely starting to bounce back from the 1970s slump that we talked about earlier in this coverage. And there was a period of unprecedented growth between 1991 and 2000. Unemployment in the year 2000 stood at 4%, the lowest it had been since the 1960s. And in fact, the economy was doing so well that while Bill Clinton was president for most of the 90s, he was not only able to balance the federal budget, but actually end up having a budget surplus, which is especially impressive, remembering we started off the decade with a deficit, a federal deficit from Reagan's time in office. So, what's driving all of this economic growth? A lot of it has to do with the computer revolution. So, the idea of a computer, or really software for a computer, first comes about in the 1800s. Ada Lovelace, a mathematician, first proposed kind of the first software, the first code, but really the first physical computer is not built until World War II. And then you have people like Alan Turing, a British uh, scientist working on computers. And initially, computers are mostly meant to solve complex mathematical equations. So during World War II, the first computers are actually built in an attempt to try to detect patterns and break codes of the Axis powers by the Allies. And computers continue to be driven mostly by doing this kind of math work until the invention of the microchip. So computers up until the mid to late 70s were very large because the microchip had not been invented yet. So a computer that had the processing power and the capacity of, say, your modern iPhone would take up a very large room. The microchip, however, which comes out of the American Space Program research, allows computers to go from taking up an entire room to fitting in the palm of your hand. So this takes a lot of the hardware of computers and shrinks it. So that way computers become much more size efficient. And early computers, especially after the invention of the microchip, we start to see computers used more in consumer products and applications. But really, where the computer takes off is in the 1980s, because the microchip now means that we can have computers small enough that you can actually market computers to consumers. So computers first begin to be used in different job fields at the office, but increasingly in the 80s, we're going to see with the launch of Apple's Macintosh introduced in 1984, computers coming into American homes as well. In fact, by the year 2000, half of all American households will have a personal computer. Today, that number is far higher. So, computers, much like television, start to reshape American work and leisure habits. And Apple, as I mentioned, enters the ring by marketing the first computer, the Macintosh, the first personal computer, in 1984. If you go on YouTube, you can find the legendary ad for the Macintosh, which references George Orwell's novel 1984, which imagined a dystopian totalitarian future. And the Macintosh in that commercial is positioned as a convention breaker, a way to change the future for the better. I highly recommend you find it. All you need to do is search Macintosh 1984 on YouTube and you'll find that ad. So while Macintosh gets their foot in the door in terms of marketing personal computers, which now become known as PCs, Microsoft rapidly becomes the dominant operating system because of bulk sales to offices and business applications. So Apple and Microsoft become the two dominant uh, computer companies in the 1980s and 1990s, and still very dominant in the industry today. And computer companies contribute to a tech boom in places like Silicon Valley, Seattle, Austin, and Manhattan in New York City. What's really going to uh, boost the potential for computers in everyone's home is the internet. Now, the internet has its origins as a military communications network, but with the expansion of the personal computer, the internet then moves from this military application that enables instantaneous communication across vast distances to now a civilian application connecting your personal computer at home with other people worldwide on computers as well. The internet changes the pace of communication and revolutionizes the way we view the world. And information becomes more democratized. So, in other words, anybody can access information on the internet, provided you don't live in a state with heavy censorship. But also, anybody can put information on the internet, right? So, you could create your own website, you could have a blog, you could have a YouTube channel, right? And put out information and ideas to share with other people across the world. You're no longer limited just to people within your own community. So our communication becomes much faster. It becomes more it becomes easier to connect to people with different ideas, or maybe the same ideas, who are geographically spread out. Back in time to World War II, when the first computers are being built by the Allies to crack Nazi secret codes, and you told them that one day their computers would be as small as to be able to be held in a hand, and that we use the power of that to watch cat videos all day, I think they would probably think you were nuts. Okay. The other thing that changes is rapidly the amount of storage on different devices. Most of my students are young enough that they have no idea what a floppy disk looks like. They think of it just as the save button icon, which looks like a floppy disk, because at the time the save icon was created, floppy disks were the way to store things externally off of your computer. And you can look up an image from Reddit which compares a modern 128 gigabyte flash drive with 132 megabytes worth of floppy disks. And it is astounding to see the difference, the physical difference. Now, increasingly, again, computer devices are shrinking, and now it's far easier to store things digitally than it was even in the 1990s.